So Lama Atisha, what he did was, he presented all of the essential points of Buddha's teachings in this experiential way. And he presented them essentially in 3 stages. The first, second and third scopes, they're called. Scope has a very specific meaning. It relates to the capacity of the practitioner, the scope, or the capability, as Lama Zopa says. So the first and second scopes of the practice, of the teachings, they represent all the teachings, all the essential points in Buddha's teachings that we know as the Hinayana part of the path, Hinayana path. Then the third scope is the Mahayana part of the path. The 3 scopes altogether is all the practices that a person who's on the Mahayana path would practice, because you need to do the first 2 scopes in order to accomplish the third. If you're a Mahayana practitioner, you don't just do the third scope, which is all the compassion. The wisdom wing is the first 2 scopes, the Hinayana part of the path, and the compassion wing is the Mahayana path. Altogether, a Mahayana practitioner would practice all of these, because you need the first 2, the wisdom wing, in order to accomplish the compassion wing. You need both wings. A bird needs 2 wings. So it's the way to, working on the wisdom wing is where you really work on yourself. You turn yourself into this amazing being, then qualified to actually do the job, of benefiting others. What we really are is a potential Buddha. If it is true that this is our true nature, this is who we really are, then we indeed need someone to show us how to do it. So we look to the need for a teacher. And then there are various ways that are explained in the texts of how to devote oneself appropriately, the very heart of which is the idea of training our minds to see the Lama, the teacher, the spiritual guide, as the Buddha. That the most benefit comes to oneself from this practice. And then our teacher gets, that point of guru devotion is put there by the 14th century Lama of this tradition called Tsongkhapa. And the third point on the preciousness of this life that we have right now, not just to take it for granted. And this gives us enormous energy to want to not waste it. Then the first point we discussed in the first scope was the need to think about impermanence, but specifically the impermanence of this very person, which energizes us to even more want to not waste this life. But death is definite. Its time is uncertain, and that the only thing that can benefit us at the time of death is the virtuous imprints in our mind, nothing else. Then this leads us on to the next contemplation, the first scope, as we discussed, which is looking at the logical likelihood of suffering lives in the future, given that we have a continuity of consciousness that is literally beginningless, given that we've been within samsara, having ignorance and therefore delusions, and therefore being reborn again and again and again, and therefore creating negative karmas endlessly, as well as positive ones. So it's logical, it's just logical, that there are there's a possibility of many suffering rebirths that our mind could take when it leaves this body at the time of death. So Atisha gets us to contemplate the suffering of the lower realms in order to energize us to have a healthy revulsion of being born in this way. This then leads us naturally to the next point, to turn for refuge to Buddha, who's the person who existed 2,500 years ago, who gave us the path, which is the actual refuge, the Dharma itself, the methods, the medicine to cure our minds, the methods to help ourselves transform ourselves, to avoid suffering in the future. And this leads us then to the culmination of the first scope, which is the essence of the practice, which is abiding by the laws of karma. Learning to know what to do and learning to know what to avoid doing, simply to avoid suffering and to get what we do want, which is happiness. It's a very practical solution, because one of the things that we're seeing clearly from understanding karma is that we are responsible for our own suffering and we're responsible for our own happiness, literally. In the second scope, we look more deeply, we look more in a more sophisticated way into our minds and start to see how even this life is in the nature of suffering. But it's much more subtle awareness we need to develop. Really is where we learn to be our own therapists. Understand very deeply in the context, for example, one way of looking at this whole scope is in the context that we discussed last week of the Four Noble Truths. That the essential point of that is the third one, which is Buddha's assertion that we can be free of suffering. This then really prepares us now to practice the second wing, the third scope, which is the work we do in relation to others. The heart of which is the development of compassion, specifically the development of the very focused, highly developed level of great compassion called bodhicitta. There's love and compassion, for example, these two essential characteristics. Love is the wish that others be happy. Compassion is the wish they don't suffer. It takes two different aspects of a person's life. So, if you love a person, you would see the person and you would be delighting in their good qualities. If you have compassion for a person, you look at the person and you have sorrow at their suffering. You wish they didn't suffer. You have empathy with them, their suffering. Right now, we have the wrong way of cherishing others. We do it because they're our friends and we want them to love us because we can keep being happy. It's completely got strings attached right now, the way we cherish others. And this is why, too, when we have our compassion now, we do have compassion now. We have compassion that's based on attachment. And so it always drags us down. That's why even if we're in the helping professions, we're being very compassionate. We get exhausted and drained, It drags us down. If we have to help people, mentally or physically, we get dragged down by it because we still have attachment to our own needs. So we're talking here of being way beyond attachment. Really extraordinary, to go to extraordinary degrees of genuinely cherishing others with no strings, which is almost inconceivable in our culture. Because in our culture, ego is the reference point. It's the realization of the wisdom of emptiness that uproots finally the instincts of ego, which completes the wisdom wing. And then the work of benefiting others is what culminates, completes the active, proactive work of benefiting others, compassion. So it's then that person who finally becomes a Buddha, they've perfected the two wings, completed the two wings, completed the wisdom, completed the compassion,